Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we are going to talk about an absolutely incredible, exciting book. It is called A Sense of the World. It has a long subtitle, but necessary, How a Blind Man Became History's Greatest Traveler. The author who's with us from Sausalito, Jason Roberts. The book is published by HarperCollins. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure.
You know, somehow it seems to me the place I have to start is way in the back of the book, where you make a summary statement about what this man accomplished. At best, this can be reconstructed, you write, by October of 1846, when Holman stepped off the Channel packet. His travels totaled no less than 250,000 miles. He could claim a thorough acquaintance with every inhabited continent and direct contact with at least 200 distinctly separate cultures, and he got to know them on the street, on the ground, so to speak. Alone, sightless, with no prior command of native languages, and with only a wisp of funds, he had forged a path equivalent to wandering to the moon. He
Yes.
really is the world's greatest traveler.
Yes, that was the biggest surprise. Is when I started researching this book 4 years ago now, I had originally started writing about, an accomplished blind man.
Yeah.
And then I realized that he was the first blind man to travel around the world. But then I started adding up the miles, and I understood, oh my gosh, this guy was in
got
fact
worse and worse.
he was the most prolific traveler of all time. And as I researched and understood what it meant to travel blind and alone with no money in the early 1800s, I ended up making an even stronger claim, which is right in the introduction. And I say that nobody before or since has experienced this world quite so vividly and completely. And that's something I still stand by. I mean, the mileage itself is impressive, but what's even more impressive was just how much in such great depth James Holman built up a very elaborate sense of understanding places. And that's why I ended up calling the book A Sense of the World.
The way he experienced the world without sight is something you try to share with us. It's a difficult concept, or it was for me.
Mm-hmm. Pretty much, we think if you are sighted, you think you know what it means to be blind. I did when I set out to write this book. The metaphor I use is that it's like you shutting your eyes and thinking you know what it means to be blind is like falling out of a tree and thinking that you know what it's like to fly. It's actually, it's a very different kind of orientation. You would have to spend several days, at least in my experience. I had to be voluntarily having my sight blindfolded. It took me about 3 days before I finally let go of the visual sense of understanding the world and turned it over to understanding the non-visual sense. And interestingly enough, it's actually much more rich and much more varied. So that was the thing that really kind of started opening up the story of James Holman, the blind traveler, to me.
Before he became blind, he was he served in the Royal Navy. Not with honors, but well.
He was a man on the rise. He went from being a midshipman to a lieutenant in the very shortest time possible. He was 18 years old. He was supposed to be 21 years old, so he actually fudged a little bit about his age. Yeah, very ambitious man, was at the height of expectation. He would have gone pretty far, I think, in the Navy. I
think you're right. He was afflicted with rheumatism, and on some of his trips, he was in a heck of a lot of pain.
Yeah, interestingly enough, rheumatoid arthritis at that particular time was occupational illness of young people and was not something associated with aging. And the reason was because he was a midshipman and then a lieutenant on a Royal Navy ship off the coast of the Americas, of the Canada, the maritime provinces, and going up and down in the stormy, cold North Atlantic, and being at sea for literally months and months at a time. It turned out that many midshipmen, literally teenagers, were becoming crippled with rheumatoid arthritis as a result of that exposure. Holman was one of them, but he had an even worse complication, and that seems that it triggered an autoimmune cascade in his brain and apparently killed his optical nerves as well.
And he becomes blind, and he doesn't want to be a beggar, and he devises this way of getting into the Naval Knights of Windsor. a strange group if there ever was one, a group that has but one function, to live in a college near the castle, and well, to put it succinctly, go to church every day.
To warm a seat, essentially. Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful order, the Naval Knights of Windsor. It sounds like this great honor. It's actually a glorified charity, and there were 7 people, and they were supposed to be living in Windsor Castle in company with the King George III himself, but due to some complications, they ended up living in a house at the very bottom of the hill of Windsor Castle. So you had these people, their job was to simply climb up and down the hill to Windsor Castle twice a day to simply offer up prayers to the royal family. Now, at that time, that was a pretty amazing gig for some people because there was no such thing as retirement fees or disabilities or anything like that.
But Holman was bored out of his mind.
Holman was 25 years old.
For that reason and some others, he decides, man, I got to travel. We'll look into his reasons for traveling when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc. Or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
A Sense of the World, How a Blind Man Became History's Greatest Traveler. That's the title of the book. Jason Roberts is the author. And, you know, before we talk about why James Holman traveled so much, let's talk about the major trips he took. The first one, if I have it straight, was about 1819. It was going to the continent, and then the reason for it was that he was going to take some baths there and he was going to feel better.
He was going to recuperate or perhaps die. It wasn't quite clear in the minds of his doctors. After he'd been made a Naval Knight of Windsor...
Try this. Maybe you'll like it.
Well, you know, what he ended up doing was rebelling against that order, and he ended up going to medical school himself. As far as I can tell, he was the first blind man to attend medical school, went to the University of Edinburgh. After enough years of that, however, it was clear that he was not going to find a cure to his blindness. And then he went back into being really sick. And it seems that this time was both depression and physical. That's me projecting a little bit. But his doctors essentially said, go to the Mediterranean. And that was kind of the last-ditch thing, to recuperate in the sunshine. He took their advice, but for some reason, he went alone. And it is a
well,
trip.
He was supposed to go with his brother, but
perhaps
his brother missed the boat.
We're not quite clear on the process, whether or not he was just, you know, a degree of suicidal self-abandon or trying to save money or something. But it's typically a trip that would take about 2 weeks of the time, and you would have nurses and attendants and all. He's just got on the ferry for France, completely alone, disappeared for a good 6 months. And then he reemerged on the coast and had essentially, even before he arrived at the Mediterranean, was completely a new man. He renewed himself by discovering that travel was kind of this transformative thing for him. And when we say that he traveled, it wasn't, you know, idle tourism. The whole point for him was it was the challenge of waking up every morning and reconstructing the world anew. And he not only did he travel so incredibly prolifically, but in tracing his trips, it's interesting how far he would go out of the way to avoid ever retracing his steps. It was the novelty, it was the sense of newness, it was the sense of this three-dimensional puzzle of the planet that kind of distracted him from his pain and gave him the momentum to keep moving.
His second trip, which was about 1822, his goal then was to circumnavigate the globe, but he got hung up in Siberia.
Bit of a challenge. Not only was he trying to circumnavigate the globe, being blind, being alone, and having almost no money, but he had to try to do it entirely in secret as well. It's really almost absurd, the amount of risk-taking, the audacity
why in
of this.
Secret?
Well, because if people understood what he was trying to do, they would have simply institutionalized him for being insane. Yeah, the measures against it. Well, I mean, he was trying to be the first person ever. Nobody, not even state official sponsored expeditions, had ever circumnavigated the globe going in that direction, going over land. So he was only the second Englishman to attempt it, and would have been the first person, period, to do it had he achieved it. So this would have been delusions of grandeur, would have been proof of of insanity. So what he did is he did it, but he did it under the auspices of pretending to visit a friend in Russia. And then he rented a cart and a native driver and made a mad dash across Siberia, hoping he'd get as far across as he could before they would catch him, before the game was up where they understood that he was, in fact, trying to go around the world. And he almost made it.
Almost. But then he had to try a second time in 1827. Again, this blind man tries again to circle the globe, and he actually makes it by 1832. And early on in the book, you have a quote from one of his many books. Behold me then in France, surrounded by a people to me strange, invisible, and incomprehensible, separated from every living being who could be supposed to take the least interest in my welfare or even existence. That was his state of affairs. And as you just said, this is the way he looked at each day, with that, same sense. And then you write, it was his first taste of the freedom of abandon, of the seductive power of plunging into the utterly unknown.
Yes, that seems to be the state that James Holman lived in, that plunging into the unknown. Interestingly enough, it wasn't just an experience that he held to himself. I mean, as you point out, that's a quotation from one of his books. He wrote several books. In fact, he was a best-selling author in his day. He was famous to the point he was almost generically known as the Blind Traveler.
Yes, he had that name. There's another place where you write about how he's feeling, and again, I think this tells us more about why he wants to travel. Holman was thankful, but he was also anything but homesick. His journey had reacquainted him with three potent forces: the invigorating embrace of risk, the engrossing immersion in the unknown, and the intoxicating company of women. And three more reasons for wanting to be on the road, so to speak.
Yes, indeed. He was a very charismatic individual, and women in particular were very much drawn to him. And he was very much the proper Victorian gentleman, but it's quite clear that he left an indelible presence in the minds and sometimes the hearts of many people.
A Sense of the World overflows with colorful details of James Holman's travels, and we'll explore some of them when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast, and we're talking today to Jason Roberts, who's written a most amazing book about a most amazing man. The book is called A Sense of the World, and it tells the story of how a blind man became history's greatest traveler. Dave Edgars himself, a very good writer, has a long statement about this book that I'd like to read. Jason Roberts, he says, has brought something great into the world. To know ourselves at all, we have to know about people like James Holman, and this is a brilliantly executed biography of this extraordinary, almost unbelievable man. Where the story of the blind traveler could have been maudlin or corny or draped in historical cobwebs, oh yes it could. A Sense of the World is alive, magisterial, suspenseful, frequently funny, full of wonder, and with a commanding sense of narrative. This is one of the best and most life-affirming biographies I've ever read. And I want to tell you, Dave Edgars has it right. Before exploring colorful details, I'd like to explore this phrase that we quoted in the last segment. And the phrase is intoxicating company of women. How? In what way? What was it about him that attracted women?
Well,
and how did he make out, so to speak?
How did he make out? Feelingly.
With women. I mean, how did he get along with them?
Touchingly, you might say.
Of course.
Yeah. In addition to him being simply a very attractive young man, it was a matter of access.
That's right. He was late 20s, early 30s when he's doing this, and he was handsome, and then good shape.
But more interestingly enough is that because he was blind, he was essentially given kind of a social free pass. Particularly, it really wasn't acceptable for men to be socializing with women at that particular time. You would not be seen alone with a woman. But for some reason, most other men would give him kind of almost a eunuch status. They presumed that because he was blind, he was somehow impervious to the physical attractions of women, and therefore it was completely socially acceptable for him in the early 1920s. We're talking about Jane Austen territory here, to not only be hanging out with women or living with single women. He actually, instance upon instance, in which he would actually move in with a countess in Italy or a señorita in France or something of that sort, and be living there quite comfortably, and there wouldn't even be a hint of scandal. He personally understood that this was very much a misunderstanding of what it meant for him to be blind, and he was, in fact, very much alive to, as we say, the intoxicating pleasures of women. You can almost hear him sighing the way that he describes some of these things.
Oh yeah.
But he's also very discreet and very, very positive. And he was something of a poet at heart. He had been a poet before he joined the Royal Navy, and he also had a photographic memory which he had developed. Obviously, he needed that to travel around the world and remember the information. So after about 5 or 10 years of this, he was an incredibly entertaining individual. His stock of stories, I think, was really strong. And essentially, he was able to listen. He was alive with listening, and I think that was a very attractive feature as well.
Yeah, one of the things that you say about women's reaction to him, they responded to him with sympathy and emotion pulls apart from pity. Mm-hmm. Other qualities, the fact that he was handsome, an officer, a war hero, a learned and well-spoken man, given to reciting poetry, also did not escape their notice, that they were sensitive to the many qualities that are there. One of the great things about this book is that it just overflows with detail and anecdote about how he got along in these various journeys, and I'd like you to talk about some of them. The one that sticks in my mind is the blind man steering a ship after it had a collision. Mm. That's interesting. Yes.
He was on his 1827 attempt to go around the world. He hadn't even gotten clear of England. They were still in the main river of the Thames, leading down to the open sea, and his ship was caught in a shipwreck late at night. And it had collided with another ship, and nobody in the chaos late at night was able to take the wheel. And he simply understood what was going on and took the wheel and started sailing the ship. And he could understand simply by hearing what was going on and the direction of the wind. Interestingly enough, when the captain found out that he was doing that, he was so amused, he let him keep sailing the ship. And he steered the ship almost all the way into harbor, and it didn't sink.
You have steered the ship of this book into a wonderful harbor of reading experience. It's an absolute delight. It's one that shouldn't be missed. The book is A Sense of the World, How a Blind Man Became History's Greatest Traveler. The author is Jason Roberts. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.